this is one of a series of things we do on what I call our debt series, bringing some speakers to campus to talk about the fiscal issues that the country faces. And I think those have real ramifications for Southern Illinois. This is a region that gets a lot of federal aid and gets a lot of state aid. And so we have a real interest in these proposals for dealing with the budget deficits in both places. And Ralph is one of the leading experts in Illinois on these questions, and I'm glad he's back to share his thoughts. I thought it'd be a perfect day to have you to come down, because today is campaigning and tomorrow we start the governing. So, Ralph, the floor is yours.
I'd like to, if you had to sum up the state's budget situation right now, and you're probably asked quite a bit, how do you usually do it at this point?
Well, the state really is really broke. And I think to sum up the budget is a pretty simple situation. We're spending beyond our means, but the simple phrase, well, you should live within your means, doesn't apply to Illinois, because Illinois' means do not support life. So without some sort of tax reform, there really is no way to solve the state's fiscal problems. And that's what has to go on the table in front of the general public these days. No one likes to talk about tax reform because taxes are never a popular issue. But it is how you finance government, and it has to be done right. And there are some basic principles about taxation that you have to meet. Doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or Republican, liberal or conservative, there's certain ways to design the system, and Illinois doesn't design its tax system that way. In fact, our tax system cannot work in a modern economy. And unless we fix that, we have deficits on into the future, no matter how much we cut spending, no matter how much we try to rein in pensions, no matter how much we do on that side of the ledger, the state will continue to be in a deficit position. So fixing tax policy is core to moving forward.
What kind of fix needs to be put in place in tax policy? What are the options out there that might actually do some good?
Yeah, there's not a lot of different ways to skin that cat. So the two big taxes you have available to you are your income tax and your sales tax. And those are the two things that the state of Illinois needs to fix. Let's start with the sales tax, because in some ways the fix there is significantly easier. There are 46 states in America that have a sales tax. Of those states, Illinois has the third most narrow tax base. That is, we have our sales tax apply to less of what's happening in the economy than 43 other states. Now, the main reason we have such a narrow base is pretty simple. We exclude virtually all services from taxation. We pretty much just have our sales tax hit the sale of products, hard physical things you can touch. That doesn't work in a modern economy. Today, only 12% of the economic activity in Illinois is the sale of goods, the things we do tax. Over 60% of the economy is the sale of services. You simply can't leave the largest and fastest growing segment of your economy entirely out of your tax base and assume you're going to generate enough revenue to balance the budget every year and to maintain service levels from year to year. So that's a core change that needs to happen. And no, we do not magically become Taxachusetts if we expand our sales tax base to include consumer services. All of our neighboring states tax services far more than Illinois does. Today already, with Kentucky, Missouri, and Indiana tax somewhere between 25 and 50% of the services we think you should be taxing. Iowa and Wisconsin already tax all of them, and in some cases more than what we think you should tax. And you just haven't seen these busloads of people from Iowa and Wisconsin coming down to Illinois to, let's say, get their haircut, because they tax haircuts in those states and we don't. Although if you've seen their haircuts, maybe you should suggest they come down, because they're really not doing a good job. So number one, and we have to expand our sales tax base to include services. It's a modernizing function, and it's core to be able to balance our budget long-term over time. The second thing that we need to do to tax policy in Illinois is go to a graduated rate structure for our income tax, much like the federal government has. Once again, there are 41 states in the nation that have an income tax, and all but 7 of those have a graduated rate structure. So again, Illinois is a tax outlier in having a flat tax across all incomes. That just doesn't work, and it doesn't work from either a fairness or a responsiveness to the economy standpoint, and that's for one simple reason. the way the distribution of income has gone over time in America, a significant portion of that income growth goes to the wealthiest 10%. In fact, from 1980 through 2007, so not including the impact of the Great Recession, we all know the Great Recession made things much worse for most working families in America, but going through normal economic cycles, the top 10% in income earners actually got 64% of all income growth in America from 1980 to 2007. 2/3 pretty much to the top 10%. Well, if you flip that statistic around, that means only about 36% of all income growth in America was left for the bottom 90% of income earners. So clearly, to be fair, to focus taxes on where incomes are growing most rapidly over time, where people would be paying their income tax out of their rapidly expanding wealth rather than their flat or declining incomes, you need a graduated rate structure, a rate structure that gets higher as incomes get higher. Illinois doesn't have that. And to fix that, we actually need a constitutional amendment that would allow the state to impose a graduated rate structure. So we need those two things to really get our tax system to just comport with the four basic principles of sound taxation in a modern capitalist economy. And right now we're 0 for 4. I think, looking forward, we have to be pretty serious about addressing these problems pretty soon. Because Illinois, always envious of bad fiscal policy elsewhere, decided the federal government shouldn't be the only entity that has a giant fiscal cliff on the horizon. So we've devised our own. The tax increase that was passed in January of 2011 was a temporary income tax increase, and it begins to phase out in the year 2015 and the year 2016, and then phases out even further down the road. But by 2016, fiscal year 2016, the first two hitches of this phase down in that income tax increase will cause the state to lose annual revenues over $3.5 billion. Can't afford that. We already have, right now, even with the tax increase in place, an $8 billion plus deficit. We just can't afford to lose $3 billion in revenue year to year. So we have to address these fiscal problems in a relatively clear horizon by 2014, because in 2015 we're really going to start feeling the impact of that fiscal cliff.
How do you think people realistically will respond to these if they should ever get these tax change policies and start talking about them in this way, moving them forward? Will they respond better than they did with the wholesale income tax increase last year? Or?
Well, it's interesting. I think if you give people good information, they might hold their nose, but they'll be okay with a tax increase. So let's build some context around this. And so despite having the 5th largest economy and 5th largest population of any state in the country, Illinois' overall spending on public services is very low. Our spending level is 43rd in the country when you adjust by income and size of population, 43rd in spending on services. We're about 40th, 39th in overall tax burden, state and local, all taxes, all fees, so including property taxes, sales taxes, driver's license fees, everything that you can put on the table. We're very low tax and we're very low spending. Despite that, we have these huge deficits. And where the state spends its money are those areas that voters and taxpayers expect the state to spend its money. In fact, 9 out of $10 the state spends through its general fund go to just 4 things: education, healthcare, social services, and public safety. So if you have huge deficits, and it's not being driven by your spending, and in fact, in real terms, after inflation, spending levels are about 24% less today than they were in 2000 even. So that's a pretty big cut in about a 12-year, 13-year period. If you're spending on good priorities and you're spending less and you nonetheless have deficits and the problem is driven by taxes and you get that message out to voters, they're like, okay, increase my taxes. And the reason I know this, there's this brilliant institution in the state of Illinois called the Simon Center on Public Policy located at Southern Illinois University, and a couple of years ago they did a poll. And one question they asked in their poll was, okay, the state has these bad budget problems. Should they solve it by cutting spending or raising taxes? Well, the majority of folks, I think upwards of 60-some-odd%, said cut spending. But don't cut education. Don't cut health care. don't cut social services, and don't cut public safety. Well, that's 9 out of $10 being spent. So there's a total disconnect in the voting public's mind between the taxes they have to pay into the public sector and the services they expect out of the public sector. Once that connection is made for voters, and you tell them where the money's going, and you tell them what's causing the problems, frankly, their responses to the tax increases are far more positive. But to be able to do that, you need real political leadership. You need an elected official that's willing to not sort of pander to voters' worst fears and personal concerns, but rather make the case for why these investments in the public sector on the front end are so important to creating stable communities, to growing our private sector economy, to really moving Illinois forward in a modern age. And so I think with that kind of political leadership, you could certainly get the changes we need on tax policy and have people at least be tolerant of them, if not like them.